On Monday, Finland implemented a new migration and asylum law that allows Finnish border guards to turn away migrants crossing into Finland from Russia. While the law is popular in Finland and passed with an overwhelming majority in the Finnish parliament, it's proved controversial with human rights and refugee groups, who argue that it represents a violation of international law. Nonetheless, despite their legal ambiguity, pushback laws have become increasingly popular in Europe over the past few years, mostly in response to the weaponization of migration flows by Belarus and Russia since 2021. So in this video, we're going to have a look at these new pushback laws, why they're controversial, and why they might still represent the future of European migration policy. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand why Finland and other European countries are turning to pushback laws, you need to know a bit about how Belarus and Russia have been trying to weaponize migration against the EU for the past few years. This story really begins in 2020, when the EU imposed sanctions on Belarus after incumbent Alexander Lukashenko apparently rigged the presidential election, sparking massive anti-government protests. During the subsequent crackdown, multiple protesters were killed by the authorities and many more apparently tortured. The sanctions escalated after Belarus intercepted a commercial aeroplane in May 2021 in order to arrest opposition activist Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend Sofia Sapega. This sparked a furious reaction from Lukashenko, and in July 2021 he threatened to, quote, flood the EU with drugs and migrants. In August 2021, the Belarusian government began flying thousands of migrants in from the Middle East, including Iraq and Syria, before sending them towards the Latvian, Lithuanian and Polish borders. Belarusian border guards provided the migrants with wire cutters to help them through the border, and abused those that didn't make it into the EU. Interestingly, while the European Commission at the time described Belarus's weaponization of migrants here as, quote, unprecedented, what sometimes euphemistically described as coercive migration diplomacy has a long history. In 2010, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi threatened to send, quote, millions of Africans to Europe unless the EU coughed up at least €5 billion a year. In 2020, Turkey unilaterally suspended the EU-Turkey migration deal after the EU refused to pay more money, sending 20,000 migrants to the Greek border. In 2021, just a couple of months before the Belarusian crisis, Morocco apparently sent roughly 8,000 migrants to the Spanish exclave of Ceuta, following a diplomatic dispute over Spain's medical treatment of Brahim Ghali, leader of the Polisario Front in Western Sahara. Anyway, in response to the surge in numbers, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia declared states of emergency and started fortifying their borders. They also all began allowing pushbacks, in other words, allowing border guards to forcibly push migrants back to the country they came from, in this case Belarus. Both a domestic Polish court and the European Court of Human Rights, which is responsible for enforcing the European Convention on Human Rights, ruled that recipient countries needed to provide better support to migrants coming over from Belarus, but the rulings were basically ignored. Pushbacks are controversial here because they most likely violate the principle of non-refoulement, a principle enshrined in international refugee law that forbids states to send asylum seekers back to countries where they may face persecution, torture or degrading treatment. In practice, this means that asylum claims have to be at least evaluated before being rejected. They can't just be turned back, especially given that neither Belarus nor Russia are obviously safe countries. Now, this isn't the first time that European states have been accused of resorting to pushbacks. Human rights groups have previously highlighted allegations of pushbacks in the Aegean Sea, along the Spanish-Moroccan border, as well as along the EU's external border in the Balkans. Nonetheless, the laws passed in Poland and its Baltic neighbours represented the first formalisation of this practice, and the number of pushbacks far exceeded anything the EU had seen before. The issue sort of faded away when the number of migrants turning up at the Belarus-EU border fell in 2022, but started rising again in 2024. At about the same time, a large number of Middle Eastern and African migrants began turning up at the 800-mile-long Russia-Finland border. According to the Finnish government, these migrants were sent there by Russia as part of a retaliatory hybrid warfare campaign in response to Finland's accession to NATO. Finland originally responded by just closing its border, but after the number of migrant arrivals didn't fall back to normal levels, the Finnish government proposed a new law that would allow Finnish border guards to turn back migrants arriving along the border. The law would be in effect for a year, during which time only certain asylum seekers, such as children or people with disabilities, would be allowed to seek protection. While the law was eventually passed by an overwhelming majority, with 167 MPs voting for it and just 31 voting against it, left-wing and Green politicians argued that it was a violation of Finland's human rights obligations. Left Alliance leader Li Andersson, for instance, who led her party to a remarkable second place at the European Parliament elections earlier this year, denounced the bill as a deportation law and reacted to its passage with a statement saying, "It is a sad day for Finland's rule of law and human rights." Nonetheless, the law seems to be popular inside Finland, and Finnish President Alexander Stubb claimed last week that the law has the support of other EU countries after the European Political Community meeting in the UK, telling reporters many people came to say that the instrument looks good, especially the leaders of the Baltic countries, and it may be that they go out and copy it. The EU has also signalled that they approve of the law, even if it might break international law. A European Commission spokesperson told journalists last week that member states have an obligation to protect their external borders. They're the ones best placed to define how they do this in practice. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise, given that von der Leyen spends a lot of time talking about the risks of weaponised migration, and that the EU's new migration pact, agreed this year and set to enter force in 2026, introduced provisions that basically allow member states to engage in turnbacks during times of emergency or when migration flows are being weaponised by third countries. Ultimately, this episode demonstrates that the efficacy or strength of international law often depends on politics. In many cases, appeals to international law don't work if the law doesn't enjoy broad support in the political community, or if it's unenforceable, as we're seeing with Israel and Gaza. It seems as if there's an emerging consensus in Europe that, if international law is interpreted as requiring member states to evaluate every asylum claim that turns up on the border, this is simply too demanding in an era of weaponised mass migration. We're not saying that we endorse this take, by the way, but the fact that de facto provisions for pushbacks were included in the EU's new migration pact does at least suggest that most of the European Parliament, and probably most of Europe, now think that controlling immigration is more important than abiding by international law, at least in its most stringent interpretation. If you want to learn more, then check out our physical magazine, Too Long. We've been working on this for a while now, but it's about to be printed and shipped. So here's everything you need to know. Too Long is 60 pages of our very best journalism, diving deeper into issues than we can on YouTube. As you can see from the front cover, this issue is focused on the UK general election, explaining what Labour want to do with their new huge majority, what each of the other parties are going to do next, and much more. It's more than just the UK though, with major stories from across Europe and the world, including the US election, the countries who could join the EU, the war in Gaza, and the European elections. We're really proud of how this product has turned out, and we think it's some of our best writing yet, able to dive into topics in a way that the algorithm just wouldn't allow. It's also a great way to support the channel, with the cost of production only increasing as we expand and advertising markets getting less stable. Your support helps us improve the business, improve our journalism, and helps us make more free YouTube content for everyone. If you're interested, you can go to toolong.news to buy a copy. There you'll find both standard and premium editions of the magazine, with the premium edition getting your name printed in the thank you section and getting you access to our behind the scenes podcast, The Bullpen. Premium editions will only be available until Thursday at 11 AM, when the print run begins, so you don't have long. You can also subscribe to Too Long, which gets you 25% off the price and a copy sent straight to you every 4 months. Subscribing really helps us turn this into a reliable revenue stream, which is super helpful when it comes to growing our business. Plus, if physical isn't your thing, then there's also digital versions. Anyway, sales close soon, so head to toolong.news to order now, and make sure to use code FINALORDERS to get an extra £2 off your purchase. Thanks for watching and for supporting TLDR.